If you're a Sidemount diver who knows nothing about servicing regulators, you gotta watch this video. Hello, and welcome to Scuba with Steve. I'm Steve. Today, we're gonna be talking about the 5 most common regulator problems that Sidemount divers experience on a pretty regular basis. The fixes we're gonna talk about today only involve a wrench and an Allen key. That's it. You should still get your regulators professionally serviced at least once a year. Don't come at me. However, if you're a Sidemount diver who dives regularly, you're probably gonna come across one of these 5 fixes before your next regulator service. What problems are we looking at today? We're gonna be looking at bubbles coming from your inner and your outer DIN O-rings, bubbles coming from your SPG, bubbles coming from between the first stage and the hose, any hose, and bubbles coming from between your second stage and the second stage hose. As Sidemount divers, we are manipulating our tanks a lot. The tanks are right by our chest and our armpits. They hit against the sides of us. These are problems that are gonna happen a lot more often than your normal single tank diver kind of problems. First problem we're gonna talk about, bubbles coming from your SPG. What does it look like? It looks like a steady stream of bubbles coming from between the gauge and the high pressure hose. Why does this happen? In between your gauge and your high pressure hose, you have a swivel that has 2 O-rings on it. If either one of these O-rings starts to just get old, as will happen with O-rings, it's gonna start to cause bubbles. We gotta fix that. How do we access the swivel? We grab the SPG, place it on a firm surface, press it down with one hand, with the other hand, wrench on the hose, and open. Swivel. How do we remove the O-rings from the swivel? You grab an O-ring pick. Okay, you gotta get an O-ring pick. I'm sorry. Beg, borrow an O-ring pick, buy. Grab an O-ring pick and the swivel. You press the O-ring pick directly into the metal above or below the O-ring. Scoop underneath and poof, it's off. That easy. Repeat the process for the second O-ring. So now, you gotta replace those O-rings. Where do you find these O-rings? Most dive shops, you can find them online pretty easy. Various small, like Save a Dive O-ring kits. So now we gotta get those O-rings back on. If they're brand new O-rings, and they're a certain type, sometimes you'll have a very hard time getting them on the swivel. They'll be too stiff. If you feel like you need to loosen up your O-rings, easy to do. Grab an O-ring pick, beg, borrow, buy an O-ring pick, put the O-ring on the O-ring pick, and then just work it up the O-ring a little bit. Now, we get a little bit of silicone grease, and the smallest dab will do. Silicone grease, O-rings, one goes on, second one repeats. You just press it into the middle, press it on. That easy. Now we've got to put it back in place, press it into the gauge, press into the wood or into the surface of whatever you have, and tight. That's it. Finger tight, hand tight, a good little but you don't have to be crazy with it. Next problem we're going to be talking about is the outer DIN O-ring. The DIN O-ring you see when you remove your dust cap. What does it look like when this guy starts to bubble? Notice exactly where the bubbles are coming from. They're coming from closer to the valve, not closer to the first stage. These are very common O-rings. They see the light of day quite often. Sometimes they can get dried out. Just a good thing to have several on hand. How to replace these O-rings? Grab an O-ring pick. Same as before, press against the metal, go underneath the O-ring. If we pierce the heck out of it, it's okay because we're gonna replace it. O-ring off. Okay, this O-ring right here, you can see it's a little bit flat. Grab yourself a brand new replacement, place it in, done. That easy. You want to put a little bit of silicone on this one, you can. Don't go crazy, but you're done. Next up, we have your inner DIN O-ring. What does it look like? Looks like a steady stream of bubbles coming from closer to the first stage than the valve. If this happens, that entire O-ring can slip out, in which case you need to turn your tank off, bleed the pressure out, and retighten, then turn your tank back on. For now, we're just gonna talk about replacing it on land. To access our inner DIN O-ring, all you need is an Allen key. Allen key inside. Different makes and models have different sizes. And the inside of this O-ring can look different in many different cases. In the case of Apex, your inner DIN O-ring is that black circle right there. This is a specific size, just replace it. Same as with any other O-ring pick in, remove, and replace. This can be found in most Save a Dive kits. This one, we make sure is very, very, very tight. The next O-ring we're gonna talk about is between any hose and the first stage. They come in two sizes, either high pressure or low pressure. Usually, these O-rings don't need to be replaced and don't cause problems unless someone servicing the reg didn't do a great job tightening it back up. Or maybe you switched your hoses around, just replaced a hose, or maybe it's a brand new regulator and someone along the way forgot to tighten that one hose all the way. If those hoses aren't tightened onto the first stage, you'll have an O-ring slip out. What does that look like? When an O-ring slips out, just a little bit of it juts out the side there. To get that O-ring back into place, you cannot just tighten the hose. If you tighten the hose, you're gonna cut that O-ring right in half, or at least put a big gouge in it. So first we have to loosen the hose, and as you see, immediately, without doing anything, just by loosening the hose, the O-ring naturally went back into the place it wants to be. Now we tighten the hose down, grab a wrench, tighten again, and that should be it. Now if it's still bubbling, maybe that O-ring needs to get replaced. Incredibly common size. The last problem we're going to talk about is the O-ring between a second stage and the hose itself. Similar to the hose to first stage type problems, this is usually caused by someone doing some repair on the regulator and not tightening down the second stage all the way onto the hose. In between most second stages and hoses, there's usually one locking nut here and the actual hose itself here. When we go to tighten or loosen the hose from the second stage, you have to make sure that we never twist the inner nut. If the inner nut twists, the entire barrel on the inside of the second stage can get torqued. If the barrel gets torqued, you might have a hard time breathing, or the whole second stage itself might just cease functioning. So whenever we go to tighten this down, it's incredibly important that the inner nut does not move. Your very first time doing this, you might want to do it in the presence of an instructor or someone who knows what they're doing with regulators. Most of the time, the O-ring itself is fine. Why? The O-ring on the inside of this hose is tucked underneath a little flange. It's tucked inside there, and then the second stage seats over and around that O-ring. Because it's tucked in by the flange, very rarely does this O-ring actually pop out. Because of this, all you really have to do is get your second stage finger tight on the hose, finger tight, one wrench to lock the inner nut in place, and one to tighten the hose onto it, and making sure that this one never moves. After you've tightened that down, make sure that we give it a check. Put it onto a tank, turn the tank on, take a breath. If the reg still breathes, you should be fine. That's how we know that that inner barrel hasn't gotten torqued. That's it. The 5 most common problems a Sidemount diver is gonna run into before you get to your next regulator service. I can't stress this enough. Get your regulators serviced once a year by someone who actually knows what they're doing, a qualified service technician. Thanks so much for watching the video. Do me a favor, like, comment, subscribe. Let me know what videos you wanna see next in the future. And until then, stay safe and go do something cool.